Hello everyone, tonight we're going to Tokyo. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a cold December night, the year 2000. A thin frost clings to the narrow streets while the hum of the city is muted under the weight of winter. We're in Setagaya, a quiet residential district bordering a public park. Families are indoors, lights dimmed, preparing for the last day of the year. It's the kind of neighborhood where people know each other, where kids ride their bikes through small alleys, and where silence usually means safety. But not this night. A murder mystery has occurred, and it's one that Japan still hasn't solved. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me where you're watching from. Maybe your town has its own cold cases waiting to be told. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The Miyazawa family lived in a two-story home at the edge of Kamisoshigaya, right against the side of a park. The father, Mikio, was in his mid-40s, working for an advertising company, a quiet, hard-working man who commuted daily into central Tokyo. His wife, Yasuko, was a kind woman, teaching lessons and helping manage the home. They had two children, 8-year-old Nina, bright and cheerful, and 6-year-old Ray, a little boy, with a shy smile and a love for trains. To their neighbors, the family seemed like any other middle-class household, modest and happy. But their house had an unusual placement. It sat at the edge of Soshigaya Park. One side faced the neighborhood, the other opened directly to a dark expanse of trees, playgrounds, and shadows. A set of stairs behind their property connected the quiet suburb with the deeper parts of the park. That design, convenient for daytime walkers, would later prove to be a vulnerability. On the evening of December 30, 2000, the neighborhood was winding down. Many families had already left Tokyo to visit relatives for New Year celebrations. Streets that normally buzzed with small chatter were eerily still. The Miyazawas spent their evening together at home. The children had gone to bed early. Mikio was possibly working late on his computer in the study. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of branches in the park. Somewhere out there, a figure was moving. Investigators later pieced together that the killer entered from the park side, climbing the fence and slipping in through a bathroom window on the second floor. This wasn't a smash-and-grab burglary. It was quiet, deliberate, almost practiced. The intruder entered a house full of life, knowing 4 people were inside. That decision alone sets the tone. This wasn't a random accident. It was intentional. What makes the scene even more unsettling is the timing. December 30 is the night before New Year's Eve, a holiday deeply sacred in Japan. It's a time when families gather, when spirits of ancestors are honored, when homes are filled with warmth. The thought that someone would choose this precise night in a peaceful district to commit an atrocity, it casts a long shadow of dread. The Miyazawas were unaware of the footsteps behind their walls, the intruder breathing the same air, creeping closer. The family's world, safe and ordinary, was seconds away from being broken. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the killer had been watching the house for days, studying their routine, or if it was an impulsive decision driven by rage or madness. That uncertainty haunts every retelling of this story. Tokyo at that time was proud of its reputation for safety. Crime existed, of course, but the idea of a home invasion quadruple murder was unimaginable. This was not the gritty underworld of organized crime. It was suburbia where children left toys on porches and neighbors shared New Year sweets. Which is why, when the case later unfolded, the entire country felt as if the very fabric of trust had been torn. One historical detail stands out. 2000 was the last year before Japan entered the new millennium with widespread digital surveillance. Neighborhoods like Setagaya didn't have cameras on every street corner. Parks weren't lit up like they are now. Police relied heavily on witness reports, footprints, and traditional forensics. That gap in time, the cusp of old and new technology, meant the killer slipped through cracks that might not exist today. An unusual detail, neighbors later said. They heard loud noises from the Miyazawa home around 11:30 p.m. A thud, maybe a crash. But in a city of millions, one more sound doesn't immediately trigger panic. People dismissed it as fireworks, a dropped object, or maybe someone moving furniture. Only later did those sounds take on a chilling meaning. They were possibly the last cries of a family under attack. The image is stark. Imagine sitting in your warm room just days before a fresh year, while outside across the park an intruder steps into someone else's home. He isn't rushing, he isn't panicked, he's steady, methodical. The Miyazawas are inside, unaware that their lives are being timed down like a silent clock. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the crime, it's the contradictions. An intruder who was both reckless and careful, a house both ordinary and exposed, a family both safe and doomed. When you step into this story, it feels less like history and more like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Tonight, as we start our journey into the Setagaya family murder, remember this opening scene, a quiet Tokyo suburb, a cold December night, a family of 4 ready for the new year. And somewhere in the darkness, footsteps that would never be forgotten. Morning light in Tokyo doesn't creep in gently. During winter, it pierces. The next day, December 31st, 2000, dawned crisp and cold. For many in Setagaya, it was supposed to be a day of last-minute shopping temple visits and preparations for the grand New Year's Eve dinner. For the Miyazawa household, though the sun rose on silence, it was unusual. Normally, Yasuko's mother, who lived just next door, would hear some activity from her daughter's family in the morning. The children, laughing doors, sliding open, small domestic sounds carrying through the thin winter air. But that morning, nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just stillness. By mid-morning, Yasuko's mother grew uneasy. She decided to walk over. The two homes were practically joined by a shared wall, connected in both structure and in routine. Family closeness meant that visits were casual, unannounced, a part of daily life. She slid open the front door and stepped inside the Miyazawa house. What she saw froze her. The entryway was disturbed. Shoes scattered the air, heavy with a metallic scent she couldn't immediately place. Her instincts told her something was very, very wrong. She called out Yasuko Mikio, no answer. Moving further inside, she found the living room in disarray. Then upstairs, the truth unfolded in brutal clarity. The entire Miyazawa family, Mikio, Yasuko, Nina, and Rei, were gone. Murdered in their own home. Her scream carried through the neighborhood, shattering the morning calm. Within hours, police swarmed the property, cordoning off the scene. Neighbors huddled together, exchanging fragments of disbelief. How could this happen here? What investigators found inside was both horrifying and deeply confusing. Unlike many crime scenes where killers attempt to flee quickly, the intruder in the Miyazawa house had lingered. This is one of the strangest aspects of the Setagaya case, one that continues to baffle detectives today. Forensic teams pieced together the sequence. It seemed Mikio had been the first attacked. He had injuries that suggested a violent struggle, possibly after hearing a noise and confronting the intruder near the staircase. Upstairs, Yasuko and little Nina were killed in their bedrooms. Rei, the youngest, was found in his bed, still in pajamas, suggesting he never had a chance to even understand what was happening. Here's the unusual detail that really unsettled investigators. After killing the family, the intruder stayed. He didn't just linger for a few minutes. Evidence suggested he remained inside the house for hours, moving through rooms as though he lived there. He used their computer logging onto websites around 1:18 a.m. He ate ice cream from their freezer. He even used the family's bathroom, leaving traces of his own bodily fluids behind. Who does that? Who murders a family and then lounges in their home as if it were a hotel? Police were quick to flood the neighborhood, canvassing every resident. But being December 31st, many families were away. Witness reports were thin. Some recalled hearing a loud thud the night before but didn't act on it. Others mentioned seeing a stranger near the park in the days leading up to the murders. But nothing concrete. A historical fact, this became one of the largest investigations in Japanese history. Over 280,000 officers would eventually be involved in the manhunt over the years, interviewing more than 125,000 people. Yet despite such scale, the case remains unsolved. That alone highlights how deeply it shook the nation. Detectives found evidence everywhere, almost too much evidence. The killer had left behind clothing, a knife, even his DNA. He left footprints that matched a rare type of shoe sold in limited numbers in Japan. He wasn't careful, he wasn't clean. And yet, despite the mountain of forensic data, his identity remains a mystery to this day. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this carelessness was intentional. Was it arrogance? Was the killer taunting them? Or was it a sign of mental instability? Someone who didn't comprehend the gravity of what he had done. One theory suggests he may have been homeless, living on the edges of a society, drifting through the park before deciding on this house. Another theory suggests he may have been connected to the Miyazawas in some way, possibly through Mikio's work. But no definitive link has ever been proven. The crime scene itself became a psychological scar on the neighborhood. Families who once felt secure in their quiet homes suddenly questioned every creak, every shadow. Parents held their children closer. Some moved away entirely. Even today, 2 decades later, the abandoned Miyazawa house still stands as a haunting monument, boarded up and untouched. Locals call it cursed, a reminder of something that should never have happened. Imagine being a neighbor waking up that morning expecting nothing more than a family visit for New Year's Eve, and instead seeing police cars' crime scene tape and the grim knowledge that right next door an entire family was destroyed overnight. The contrast between holiday joy and absolute tragedy couldn't be sharper. And then there's the grandmother, Yasuko's mother. The shock of discovering her daughter, her son-in-law, and her grandchildren in that state is almost unbearable to think about. It's said she never fully recovered from the trauma. Her grief, woven into the story, makes it not just a crime, but a generational wound. By the end of that December 31st, the Setagaya case was already headline news across Japan. Reporters gathered outside the quiet street, broadcasting live as police vans came and went. People across the country preparing their own New Year's dinners sat frozen before their televisions. The question wasn't just who could do this, it was how could anyone do this in Japan, a place known for safety, order, and harmony. The morning discovery had turned a simple suburban neighborhood into the epicenter of a mystery that would haunt an entire nation. And as the investigation began, detectives realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary criminal. This was something else, something darker, stranger, and far more elusive than they had ever encountered. The Setagaya house was no longer a home, it was a labyrinth of evidence. The police sealed it off methodically, photographing every room, every object out of place. What they found inside blurred the line between chilling crime scene and surreal performance. Mikio, the father, appeared to have fought back. There were signs of a struggle near the staircase. He had injuries consistent with a knife, but also blunt trauma, which raised questions: had the killer brought multiple weapons? Or had he improvised? Investigators discovered one knife had actually snapped during the attack, and the killer had gone into the kitchen to fetch another. That small detail, grabbing a knife from the family's own drawer, was unsettling. It meant he wasn't rushing. He was comfortable enough to roam the house mid-crime. Yasuko, the mother, was found upstairs with her daughter, Nina. Both showed defensive wounds, evidence of a desperate attempt to resist. Little Ray, the youngest, had not even left his futon. His life was taken silently, almost gently, compared to the others. It was this contrast, the brutality against the parents and eldest child versus the quiet end for Ray, that puzzled detectives. Was it random, or did it reveal something about the killer's psychology? Now comes the strange part. After murdering the family, the intruder didn't flee. He lingered. This wasn't just a few minutes of hesitation, it was hours. The timeline pieced together by police painted a bizarre picture. He rifled through drawers, scattering papers and personal items. He sat down at the family computer and attempted to log into the internet. Investigators later confirmed the machine was accessed around 1:18 a.m. He checked websites, opened files, and even attempted to buy a plane ticket. Imagine that, sitting in the home of the family you've just murdered, scrolling the internet like it's nothing. He ate food from the fridge, ice cream, drinks, snacks. He used the bathroom, leaving behind unflushed evidence that DNA analysts would later collect. He changed clothes, abandoning his own blood-stained garments and replacing them with some from the family's drawers. At one point, he even napped on the sofa as if claiming the house as his own. This behavior left investigators baffled. Was he delusional? Was he mocking the system? Or did he simply not fear being caught? Even seasoned detectives admitted they had never seen anything like it. The forensic evidence piled up quickly. The killer's fingerprints were everywhere, on banisters, on doors, on everyday objects. His blood was found on the broken knife, on tissues on the floor. The clothing he left behind included a hat, gloves, and a scarf. His shoes, rare Slazenger sneakers, sold in limited numbers in Japan, left distinct footprints across the home. It seemed like a gift-wrapped case. And yet it wasn't. A historical fact, Japanese police are known for their thoroughness. Crime scene investigation there is meticulous to a fault. But in this case, too much evidence became a curse. The sheer volume was overwhelming, and the picture it painted didn't align with typical criminal behavior. Instead of narrowing the suspect pool, it opened up endless new questions. One unusual detail stood out: sand. In the killer's clothing and bag, forensic teams found grains of sand traced back to a U.S. military base in Japan, specifically Yokota Air Base. How did it get there? Was the killer connected to the base? Was he a dependent of an American serviceman? Or had the sand traveled by accident, clinging to second-hand clothes? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was a major clue or just a coincidence. Even stranger was the DNA. Testing revealed the killer was male with mixed ancestry, an unusual combination for Japan. His mitochondrial DNA suggested a mother of East Asian descent, possibly Japanese or Korean, while his father's lineage pointed to Southern Europe. This set off a wave of speculation. Was the killer a foreigner, a mixed-race local, or perhaps a transient with no official records in the country? Despite the treasure trove of genetic material, no match was ever found in police databases. Not in Japan, not internationally. It was as if the man didn't exist on paper. Then came the personal belongings. The killer left behind items that hinted at his identity: a jacket, a hat, a bag. Some were traced back to stores in Tokyo. Detectives even narrowed down one shirt to being sold in a small batch, meaning the number of possible buyers was limited. Yet every lead fizzled. Each trail hit a dead end. The psychology of the intruder became the center of debate. Why kill the family? Why linger? Why leave behind so much of himself? Some criminologists suggested he may have been mentally unstable, detached from reality. Others argued he could have been a thrill-seeker, intoxicated by the power of taking over a family's life and space. Still others proposed he was inexperienced, perhaps committing his first crime, making reckless mistakes. But here's where the case tilts into nightmare territory. What if he was experienced? What if leaving evidence was intentional, a form of psychological warfare daring investigators to catch him? The longer police spent inside the house, the less sense it made. A home, once filled with laughter toys and family dinners, now felt invaded by an alien presence. The lingering traces of the killer, his fingerprints, his trash, his clothes clashed grotesquely with the domestic warmth of the Miyazawa's belongings. It was as if two lives had collided in the same space, violently overlapping for one night. Neighbors who peeked at the house afterwards spoke of an aura, a heaviness that made them shudder. Some said they could still hear noises at night, creaks from the abandoned rooms. Over time, local children dared each other to approach it, whispering about the ghost family inside. And yet for detectives, the horror was not supernatural. It was practical. They had everything they needed to identify the man, and still he slipped through their fingers. The crime scene was more than a murder site. It was a riddle carved into the walls of a suburban home. Every item left behind told a story, but none of the stories added up. The Setagaya house would never again be just another residence. It had transformed into Japan's most confounding crime scene, one that police could enter and analyze, but never truly solve. The search for suspects began before dawn. Detectives knew they had a peculiar problem: too much evidence and too little direction. Normally in a homicide case, police scrambled to piece together a timeline of where the killer entered and exited. But here the man had practically lived in the house. His DNA fingerprints, footprints, every trace screamed his presence, and still he had no name. The first logical step was to look close. Who knew the Miyazawa family? Who bore a grudge Mikio had worked at a company linked to NHK, Japan's broadcasting giant? He wasn't a flashy executive, just a diligent employee. He had no known enemies. Yasuko, a warm and friendly woman, taught cram school lessons at home, tutoring local children. Her students adored her parents, respected her. Their daughter Nina had friends in the neighborhood. Little Ray, too young to quarrel, was loved by everyone who knew him. Detectives interviewed neighbors, family, colleagues. Had anyone seen a stranger lurking? Had anyone heard suspicious noises? A few neighbors mentioned something odd, the sound of banging and shuffling around. 11:30 p.m. One woman even recalled hearing what she thought were angry voices, but at the time nobody raised an alarm. Tokyo's suburbs are safe after all. Safe until they aren't. Investigators quickly turned their attention to the nearby skate park. Built adjacent to the Miyazawa house, it had been a sore spot for Mikio. He disliked the noise, the late-night commotion, the youths loitering by his fence. Police wondered, could a dispute have escalated? Could one of the teenagers or someone older who frequented the park have snapped? Officers canvassed the park, questioned regulars, tracked down anyone with ties to that area. Nothing concrete emerged. None of the kids matched the rare sneakers left at the scene. None carried the kind of mixed ancestry DNA revealed by testing. Still, police didn't dismiss the theory entirely. Maybe it wasn't one of the teens, but someone who hung around them, someone transient, someone with a shadowy background. Another angle robbery. Perhaps the killer had broken in with the intent to steal. But the evidence destroyed that theory quickly. Money and valuables remained untouched. The killer had left cash behind, even coins spilled on the floor. Jewelry sat undisturbed. What kind of robber kills 4 people, then takes nothing? A strange detail only deepened suspicion. The killer had taken the time to neatly stack some of the family's belongings in odd places as though arranging them for later. It didn't resemble hurried theft, it resembled obsession. Next, investigators considered a personal connection. Could the killer have known Yasuko through her tutoring work? Perhaps a disgruntled parent or unstable student. Police combed her records, talked to families, checked alibis. Every one of them cleared. They even questioned relatives of the Miyazawas themselves. It was brutal, but necessary. In homicide, the sad truth is that family members often appear on the suspect list first. But the Miyazawa relatives had no motive, no opportunity, no reason to commit such a horrific act. The trail kept circling back to the killer's belongings. That rare brand of sneakers, Slazenger, was imported into Japan in small numbers. Detectives painstakingly tracked sales records, visiting shops, identifying each buyer. For a while it looked promising. A list of possible owners narrowed the search. But none of them matched the DNA. Dead end. The clothing left behind was equally frustrating. Some pieces traced back to stores in Shibuya sold in limited runs. Investigators thought they had their lead. Narrowing down who bought the exact shirt should point them to the killer. But when they finally cross-checked everything, the results were muddy. Second-hand shops' gifts, hand-me-downs. The trail dissolved into uncertainty. Then came the bombshell clue. DNA results suggested foreign ancestry. The profile indicated a mother with East Asian roots and a father with Southern European lineage. That was rare in Japan at the time. Investigators floated the possibility that the killer was connected to Yokota Air Base, a US military installation not far from Tokyo. That would explain the sand found in his clothing. For a moment, the air base theory electrified the investigation. Was the killer the child of an American serviceman and a Japanese or Korean woman? Could he have been living on or near the base? Police reached out quietly to American authorities. But, even with cooperation, nothing stuck. No servicemen or dependents matched the evidence. Again, a dead end. An unusual detail surfaced in interviews days before the murders. A suspicious man had been spotted in the neighborhood. He wore clothes similar to those later found at the crime scene. He had been loitering, even peeking around fences. Was this the same man? Witnesses couldn't be certain. Some swore he looked foreign, others insisted he was Japanese, but strange. Eyewitness memories blurred with time. Detectives felt the case slipping. They had a mountain of physical evidence, but suspects kept dissolving under scrutiny. Too many possibilities, too few answers. This is where investigators and criminologists diverged in debate. Some argued the abundance of evidence meant the killer was inexperienced, sloppy, likely young. Others countered that leaving so much evidence could have been deliberate, a calculated move to confuse and overwhelm. If the latter, then the man was far more dangerous than a reckless intruder. He was a strategist. The working theories narrowed into three primary camps. 1. The local theory: he was someone tied to the skate park, a drifter, or a neighbor with grudges. 2. The military connection theory: he had ties to Yokota Air Base, explaining the sand and mixed DNA. 3. The phantom theory: a foreigner or undocumented individual who disappeared from Japan immediately after the killings. Each theory carried weight, each collapsed under closer scrutiny. Meanwhile, the Setagaya house loomed in silence, guarded by yellow tape and the weight of unanswered questions. And through it all, one chilling reality settled over Tokyo's investigators. The killer could be walking free, blending into the crowds, unbothered by the fact that he had left his entire forensic signature behind. The DNA was supposed to be the silver bullet. In the modern world of forensic science, where even the faintest trace of skin cells or a strand of hair can crack open a cold case, detectives were confident the killer's genetic trail would lead them to his name. And in some ways it did. It told them exactly who he wasn't. The samples collected from the Setagaya crime scene were abundant. The killer's blood was found in multiple places, evidence he had cut himself during the struggle with Mikio. Sweat traces clung to the clothing he had abandoned. Skin cells lined the fibers of the towels he had used. He hadn't just touched the house, he had practically stamped his genetic code across it. When the results came back, investigators were stunned. The DNA pointed to someone with a mixed background, East Asian on the maternal side, Southern European on the paternal. That combination was unusual in Japan in the year 2000. It narrowed the pool of suspects dramatically, or at least that's what the detectives thought at first. The Japanese media quickly seized on this angle, reporting the possibility that the killer was biracial, possibly linked to foreign communities living near Tokyo. The whispers grew louder. Could he have been connected to Yokota Air Base, where American servicemen and their families had lived for decades? This theory seemed plausible. The sand found in the killer's clothing matched a type commonly used in areas around US military installations. Coincidence or smoking gun? But here's where things got messy. When authorities discreetly coordinated with American and Japanese military officials to compare the DNA profile with known individuals tied to the base, no match appeared. The military theory began to collapse. Either the killer had no connection to the base, or he had slipped through its records entirely, and still the DNA kept taunting investigators. Imagine sitting in the evidence lab staring at a test result that tells you exactly what a man's ancestry is, but gives you no name, no address, no past. A ghost with a family tree but no identity. Some detectives pushed another idea. The killer could have been a foreign exchange student or the child of an immigrant family living quietly in Japan, unnoticed by mainstream society. That could explain why he seemed out of place in Setagaya. But again, without a database to match him against the DNA, meant nothing. Here's the strange twist. Despite the abundance of genetic material, Japanese authorities have never uploaded the profile to international DNA databases like Interpol's or CODIS in the US. The official explanation: privacy laws. Japan maintains some of the strictest protections on genetic data in the world. But off the record, criminologists wonder if there were deeper political reasons. Sharing the data internationally might have led to unwanted diplomatic complications. So the killer's DNA sits in storage, fully mapped, precise, yet effectively locked away. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this decision was a tragic error that doomed the case to permanent limbo. Another oddity: the killer's mitochondrial DNA traced through the maternal line showed connections to people from Northeast Asia, particularly around Korea. That discovery opened an entirely new door of speculation. Could the killer have been a Korean-Japanese individual? Could he have traveled back and forth between countries? Some reports even suggested the killer might not have been a Japanese national at all, but a foreign visitor. The debate sparked a firestorm in academic circles. If the killer was foreign, it would explain why no Japanese records matched him. If he was biracial, it would explain the unusual ancestry markers. But others cautioned the killer might still be fully Japanese in terms of citizenship, simply descended from a more complex genetic line. After all, DNA doesn't carry passports. Another puzzle came from the killer's age. Forensic experts analyzed the condition of his bones through DNA methylation patterns and other genetic markers. Their estimate placed him in his 20s at the time of the crime, young, physically strong, reckless enough to stay in the house for hours after the killings. It fit the picture painted by his sloppy yet brazen behavior. And then there's the detail that still unsettles seasoned investigators: the killer used the Miyazawa's first aid kit to treat his own wound. Bandages soaked in his blood were left behind. It was as though he believed he had time to patch himself up in the very home where he had slaughtered 4 people. Who does that? One school of thought argues this points to a psychologically unstable individual, possibly with antisocial or borderline personality traits. Another interpretation, more chilling, is that he was calm, too calm. He had entered a state of detachment, methodically treating himself before wandering into the kitchen for ice cream. Some criminologists compare this moment to soldiers in combat zones who after violence automatically tend to their wounds without panic. Could the killer have had military experience training? Or was he simply a young man with a disturbingly cold emotional core? The DNA didn't answer those questions. It only magnified them. At this stage, police believed they had enough to eventually catch him. They just needed time. His blood, his sweat, his skin cells, they were patient. Sooner or later, he would surface again in another database. Sooner or later, his name would connect to the ghost at Setagaya. But 2 decades later, the DNA is still waiting. That's the cruel irony of this case the killer left behind, one of the richest forensic trails in Japanese criminal history, and yet his identity remains one of the country's greatest mysteries. And in the stillness of the sealed-off Miyazawa house, that DNA lingers like a mocking whisper, "You know me, but you don't." The Setagaya crime scene wasn't just littered with DNA and blood. The killer, in his strange carelessness or perhaps arrogance, had left behind something far more intimate, his clothing. In the closet of the Miyazawa home, police discovered a set of garments that didn't belong to any family member. A greyish-green jacket, a black knit hat, a hip bag, and a pair of sneakers. These weren't forgotten laundry items. They were the killer's own, and as investigators examined them under the harsh fluorescent lights of the evidence room, a picture of a person began to emerge. The sneakers were particularly telling, a pair of Slazenger brand shoes, size 27 cm manufactured in South Korea. That size wasn't especially common in Japan at the time, and the distribution records showed that only a few dozen pairs had been sold nationwide. Investigators tracked the sales, they interviewed shop owners, they checked import records. Eventually they concluded something startling. The pair worn by the killer might have been one of just a handful circulating in the entire Tokyo area. It was as if he had been walking around in an identification tag. But the shoes alone weren't the strangest part. His jacket contained sand, tiny grains lodged deep in the fabric fibers. Under a microscope, analysts compared them to reference samples. The result? The sand bore striking similarities to a type found near an American military base in Japan, specifically Yokota Air Base, about 40 kilometers from Setagaya. It was the same base that had already hovered in speculation thanks to the killer's unusual DNA profile. Imagine being an investigator at that moment. You've got a young suspect with half-European ancestry, foreign-made sneakers and sand linked to a US base. It was like the universe was pointing neon arrows at the same theory. But as so often happens in this case, every lead unraveled. None of the servicemen stationed at the base matched the profile. None of their dependents matched either. If the killer had a connection to Yokota, it was indirect at best. The hip bag added another layer of weirdness. Inside, forensic examiners discovered traces of birdseed. Yes, birdseed. Who carries bird food around while committing a quadruple homicide? It suggested the killer either had a pet bird or spent time in a place where birds were kept. Investigators canvassed local pet shops, aviaries, even nearby zoos, hoping the detail would tie him to a specific location. Nothing. Another dead end. And then there was the jacket itself. Cheap, mass-produced, but worn in a peculiar way. Fibers collected from inside suggested the killer had been sweating heavily while wearing it, perhaps nervous, perhaps exerting himself in the struggle with Mikio. But one strange discovery puzzled investigators. The jacket was unusually clean of the Miyazawa's blood. For someone who had brutally stabbed 4 people, he'd managed to keep that outer layer remarkably untouched. Had he removed it before the killings? Had he changed mid-crime? Nobody could explain it. What about the hat forensic testing revealed strands of the killer's hair confirming his age estimate of early 20s? The fibers indicated he hadn't washed it recently, suggesting a young man possibly single with limited hygiene habits. Combined with the fast food wrappers he left behind, detectives began forming a profile, young, possibly transient, maybe even homeless. Yet the most chilling element wasn't what these items told investigators about his background, it was what they said about his state of mind. He had left behind clothing, shoes, personal items. Most killers, even impulsive ones, try to erase themselves from a scene. This man had done the opposite, scattering pieces of his identity like breadcrumbs. Was it arrogance, carelessness, or, as some psychologists later suggested, a subconscious desire to be caught? Here's the haunting thing: investigators later revealed that one item, a sweater, had been washed in laundry detergent before being worn. Its fabric carried traces of a very specific brand of soap sold in only a few Tokyo districts. That detail narrowed down where the killer might have shopped. Police even released descriptions of the detergent and clothing to the public, hoping someone would come forward. But no one ever did. To this day, criminologists still debate the meaning of these abandoned items. Some argue they show immaturity. The killer was a reckless youth who didn't fully grasp the consequences of his actions. Others interpret it differently, that he knew Japan's investigative system inside out, and he was mocking it, leaving behind evidence that could be studied for decades, while knowing none of it would tie back to his name. And the strangest twist, a full year after the murders, police conducted a public display of the clothing items, hoping fresh eyes might recognize them. Thousands came, but not a single lead emerged. The killer's belongings had become museum pieces in one of Japan's most infamous unsolved cases. The Miyazawa homes, sealed off from the world, remained frozen in time, and tucked away inside police lockers, the killer's shoes, hat, and bag waited silently, as if daring someone to see the face that had once worn them. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those clothes represent the greatest missed opportunity in modern Japanese policing. The most unnerving part of the Setagaya murders wasn't just the violence itself, it was what the killer did afterward. Normally, a murderer flees the scene as quickly as possible, every second increasing the risk of discovery. But here the killer lingered. He stayed inside the Miyazawa house for hours. Some investigators believe he didn't leave until dawn. Think about that for a second. The house filled with silence, 4 lives extinguished. Yet this intruder made himself comfortable as if he lived there. First, he raided the kitchen. Police found empty ice cream containers, partially eaten melon, and some beverages consumed straight from the carton. The killer had sat at the family table in the same chairs the Miyazawas had once used for dinner, casually helping himself. Imagine the surreal image: a bloodied young man, knife still sticky from the crime, calmly spooning ice cream while the victims lay only meters away. But he wasn't finished. He logged onto Mikio's computer. Digital forensics revealed that at around 1:18 a.m., someone accessed the family's computer to open a few files and attempt an online connection. For reasons no one has ever fully explained, the killer seemed interested in using the internet right there in the crime scene. Some detectives theorize he wanted to check his email or cover his tracks. Others think he was taunting investigators, testing how far he could go. The behavior becomes even stranger when you consider the bathroom. Forensic teams discovered clear evidence the killer had used the toilet, then left without flushing. Yes, his waste was there, studied in labs, adding to the already extensive DNA evidence. No attempt to hide, almost like he was leaving a calling card. And then there was the blood. The killer had injured himself during the attacks, most likely cutting his own hand while stabbing repeatedly. Instead of bandaging himself with care, he used the Miyazawa's first aid kit, sloppily wrapping gauze around his wounds and leaving traces of his own blood all over the house, on walls, on the banister, on the phone. His DNA was everywhere, but perhaps the most chilling act of all was his choice to sleep. Yes, there's evidence he may have rested on the Miyazawa's couch after the murders. Some blood patterns suggest he lay down, closed his eyes, and drifted off. If true, this paints a terrifying picture, a killer so at ease with his crime that he napped among the dead. Why would anyone do this? Criminal profilers have long wrestled with that question. One school of thought argues he was disorganized, young, impulsive, perhaps mentally unstable, with no clear escape plan. His strange behavior was the byproduct of shock and adrenaline wearing off. Another camp sees something darker: arrogance, that he felt untouchable, that he believed Japanese police couldn't catch him, so he indulged himself in the victim's home without fear. But there's a third theory, one that unsettles even seasoned investigators. Perhaps he wasn't alone. Some criminologists speculate that he lingered because he was waiting, maybe for someone else, maybe for a ride, maybe for instructions. If he was connected to an organization, a gang, or even a military unit, his delay could have been part of the plan. A chilling possibility that ties back to the DNA hints of non-Japanese ancestry. Still, the evidence of his movements is meticulous. Police reconstructed his timeline. Around midnight, the killings occur. Shortly after, he raids the fridge. Between 1 Shurs and 2 a.m. he's on the computer. By 3 a.m. he's bandaging himself. Possibly he rests on the couch. Sometime between 4 and 6 a.m. he finally leaves. All of this while blood seeped through the floorboards and outside New Year's Eve fireworks occasionally crackled in the distance. One detail continues to disturb detectives. On the family's answering machine, a message had been recorded while the killer was still inside. A relative had called to check in, unaware of what had just happened. The phone rang, the machine clicked. The killer, only a few steps away, ignored it. He didn't erase the message, didn't answer, just let it play. That simple choice preserved a haunting timestamp for investigators. Imagine how surreal it must have been for the victims' relatives, later knowing their voices reached that house while the murderer still walked its halls. What makes this part of the case so unforgettable is how deeply human and disturbingly casual the killer's behavior was. Eating dessert, surfing the internet, using the toilet. It's not the profile of a cold, efficient professional. It's messy, it's intimate, it's almost domestic. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this bizarre comfort points to immaturity, arrogance, or something more complex, a psyche that blurred murder and ordinary life into the same nightmarish act. And when he finally stepped out into the cold Tokyo dawn, he left behind not just bodies and evidence, but a silence that still echoes through Japan today. When dawn broke on December 31st, 2000, the quiet neighborhood of Setagaya began stirring awake. Most residents were still wrapped up in New Year's preparations, hanging decorations, preparing osechi ryori, the traditional holiday dishes, and looking forward to family gatherings. But at the Miyazawa house, nothing stirred. The first to notice something was wrong was Yasuko's mother. She had been trying to contact her daughter the night before, but the phone had rung unanswered. By morning, that uneasy feeling gnawed at her. At 10 a.m., she walked the short distance to the house and knocked. No reply. The curtains remained drawn. A silence hung in the air that felt unnatural. Finally, she let herself inside. What she discovered was beyond comprehension. The bodies of her daughter Yasuko, her son-in-law Mikio, and their 2 grandchildren Rei and Nina were scattered in horrifying stillness. Shock turned her world to ash. Neighbors soon heard her cries and rushed over, but nothing could be done. Police were called immediately, and the scene quickly swarmed with investigators. This was no ordinary crime. It was a family annihilation in a safe suburban neighborhood, just a short drive from one of Tokyo's most populated districts. Reporters would later say it was the kind of crime that shattered Japan's illusion of safety. Within hours, the street was cordoned off. Television cameras arrived zooming in on the quiet villa-style house with its modern design and small yard. Yellow police tape fluttered in the cold December wind, its bright color in stark contrast with the grey Tokyo sky. For the neighbors, it was surreal. Children who had played with Nina only days before now stared wide-eyed as officers carried evidence bags out of the home. As investigators poured inside, they began piecing together a timeline. Interviews with neighbors revealed something eerie. Several reported hearing loud noises between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, a sound like someone shouting, followed by a heavy thud. One neighbor said her walls shook. At the time, she thought it might be a family argument or a fall. Another neighbor recalled the barking of dogs in the distance, unusually intense around that hour. Even more telling was the noise of footsteps on the family's second floor, reported by someone living adjacent to the Miyazawas. They described it as unnatural movement around 1 a.m. Looking back, it lined up perfectly with the killer's lingering presence in the house. And then there were the phone lines. Police confirmed that around 1:18 a.m. the family's computer was used to attempt an internet connection. That odd digital footprint served as a chilling confirmation that the killer was still alive and moving about long after the victims were dead. CCTV footage in the area was limited at the time. This was the year 2000, before widespread camera coverage. Yet detectives still scoured train stations and nearby intersections for anyone suspicious. Some eyewitnesses claimed to have seen a young man, possibly with an injury to his hand, buying bandages or leaving the area in the early hours. But nothing concrete tied back. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Japan prided itself on being one of the safest countries in the world, where children walked to school alone and neighborhoods felt secure. Suddenly, a family had been slaughtered in their own home, and the killer had treated the crime scene like a hotel. Panic rippled outward. Parents clutched their children tighter. Hardware stores reported a spike in sales of new locks and security systems. Talk shows filled airtime with speculation. Was this a robbery gone wrong, a targeted killing of foreign assailant? Theories multiplied faster than facts could confirm them. Police presence in Setagaya ballooned overnight. Uniformed officers knocked on doors, interviewed everyone within a 1-kilometer radius, collected security reports and combed the park behind the Miyazawa house for discarded weapons or clothing. Helicopters buzzed overhead. At its peak, over 246,000 officers were involved in the investigation over the following months, one of the largest mobilizations in Japanese criminal history. But in the days immediately following the crime, what gripped the public most was the sheer strangeness of the evidence. Newspapers leaked details the killer had eaten ice cream, used the toilet, left behind clothing and blood. What kind of person does that became the question repeated in living rooms across Japan. Some pointed fingers at outsiders. The Miyazawa home backed onto a park frequented by skateboarders and teenagers at night. Could it have been one of them? Others whispered about the strange DNA results that would soon be announced, suggesting the killer might not be fully Japanese. And then there were the rumors a disgruntled colleague, a stalker, even organized crime. Through it all, one chilling truth anchored the community's fear: the murderer was still out there. Somewhere, a young man who had invaded their neighborhood and destroyed an entire family was walking free, perhaps blending back into daily life. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the killer slipped away quietly that morning into Tokyo's endless sprawl, or whether he vanished into another country altogether. But for the people of Setagaya, the shock was permanent. Every time they passed the Miyazawa house, they were reminded that safety was an illusion, and sometimes the darkest acts happen in the place you least expect, just a few doors down from your own. The scene inside the Miyazawa home was a puzzle box of contradictions. On one hand, the brutality of the killings suggested rage, 4 lives snuffed out with staggering violence. On the other, the carelessness with which the killer lingered spoke almost of indifference. It was as though he hadn't been concerned about being caught at all. Detectives catalogued everything, and the list of what the killer left behind quickly grew surreal. First, there was the clothing. Near the bodies, police found a shirt and a fleece jacket, both spattered with blood. These weren't random rags, they were high-quality garments, manufactured and sold in Japan. Yet when traced, investigators discovered that these exact items were imported in very small numbers from South Korea. Out of thousands produced, only a handful had been shipped to Japan. This meant whoever wore them was part of a very limited pool of buyers. Then there were the gloves. The killer had brought a pair, but seemed to discard them midway through handling the crime scene with bare hands. That decision left behind clear fingerprints. These weren't smudged or partial, they were crisp and plentiful. The police database lit up with hundreds of matches to cross-reference, but oddly, none aligned with known criminals. The prints belonged to a ghost, a man who didn't officially exist in any Japanese record. And let's not forget the weapon. Investigators identified a sashimi knife purchased locally at a shop in Suginami, just a few kilometers away. The blade bore traces of the victim's blood as well as the killer's. Even stranger, the handle showed signs of breaking during the attack, suggesting the murderer had used it with such force that he fractured the weapon in his hands. Drops of his blood marked the house, leading detectives to conclude he had injured himself. The DNA was perhaps the most tantalizing clue. Forensic teams confirmed it was male and not Japanese in origin. Studies suggested markers linked to South Korean or Northern Chinese ancestry. Later analysis even hinted at a mix, possibly half Korean, half Japanese, or a broader East Asian lineage. Still, DNA databases in 2000 were limited and no matches were found. To this day, investigators and detectives are still debating whether the foreign ancestry clue was a red herring or the key to identifying him. Equally bizarre were the personal belongings he abandoned. A hip bag was left behind containing sand that scientists traced back to a US military base in California. A handkerchief was found traced to a specific batch sold in Tokyo. And the killer's shoes, a pair of rare Slazenger sneakers, sized 27 centimeters. Investigators managed to track the batch. They had only been sold in South Korea, not Japan. One by one, these items painted the outline of a person, both ordinary and extraordinary. A young man in his 20s, average build, someone who had access to imported goods and perhaps foreign locations. Yet none of it ever converged into a name. Another oddity, the killer had used the family's computer. At 1:18 a.m. he attempted to connect to the internet, possibly out of curiosity or to erase something. Police digital experts recovered logs of mouse clicks and attempts to open files. Nothing valuable was deleted. It was as if he was just killing time. Literally. Then came the refrigerator. The Miyazawa's kitchen had been raided for snacks. Ice cream containers were found empty. Tea bottles were half drunk. He had even eaten some melon and barley tea. In an especially strange detail, he left his excrement unflushed in the toilet. It was the kind of act that felt almost mocking, a smear of disdain for the family he had destroyed. And yet, despite this mountain of physical evidence, everything led to dead ends. Police followed hundreds of leads, garment manufacturers, foreign military connections, rare shoe shipments. Each thread unraveled into nothing. Meanwhile, the public grew restless. Newspapers described the investigation as a labyrinth of clues. TV programs ran hour-long specials presenting maps, timelines, and psychological profiles. Citizens wrote in with tips: a suspicious traveler here, a bleeding young man there, someone buying bandages in a 24-hour store around 3 a.m. All were checked. None led to an arrest. Inside police circles, frustration boiled. The Setagaya case was consuming vast resources, thousands of officers, countless hours, millions of yen, and still no suspect. The case was quickly labeled an urban legend in the making, an unsolved riddle for Tokyo's new millennium. Yet detectives refused to surrender. Every odd detail was catalogued, every anomaly noted. Why would a killer risk staying in the house for so long? Why leave behind such identifiable possessions? Was it arrogance, recklessness, or something else? Perhaps he was inexperienced, unprepared. A young man spiraling after a crime of passion? Or was it carefully staged chaos meant to mislead investigators entirely? Whatever the truth, the Miyazawa home had become not just a crime scene, but a museum of unanswered questions. And the longer those questions went unanswered, the more the public began to doubt whether the Japanese police, so famous for their near-perfect conviction rates, would ever be able to solve this particular case. When word of the Miyazawa family murders spread, it wasn't just another crime report. It was an earthquake in Tokyo's collective consciousness. The story dominated morning talk shows, evening bulletins, and special late-night broadcasts. The tragedy had occurred in Setagaya, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood that seemed the very image of Japanese safety. If such horror could happen, there it could happen anywhere. The Japanese press is known for restraint, but in this case restraint cracked. Headlines screamed across front pages: family of 4, brutally slain in their home, monster stalks Setagaya. Television programs replayed images of police officers swarming the house, neighbors weeping behind masks, and forensic teams wheeling out boxes of evidence. Public emotion hardened quickly. Fear gave way to outrage. For many Japanese citizens, there was a sense of betrayal. How could their famously efficient police force, with one of the highest clearance rates in the world, stumble so badly here? The details only deepened the wound. Each time new evidence leaked about the killer eating ice cream about him, using the family computer, about the unflushed toilet, it seemed to mock not only the victims, but the entire nation. The killer had lingered. He had been sloppy. He had left fingerprints and DNA, and yet he had vanished without a trace. Talk shows filled airtime with speculation. Some experts suggested the killer was a disturbed local youth. Others insisted he must have been a foreigner, pointing to the DNA evidence and the rare sneakers traced to South Korea. A few voices went further, whispering about organized crime or intelligence operatives. Theories multiplied, but none gave comfort. In Setagaya, the atmosphere changed overnight. Neighbors locked their doors with new bolts. Curtains stayed drawn. Children were escorted to school. People whispered about the killer possibly still living nearby. Remember, investigators at one point believed he might have injured himself badly. So where did he go afterward? Did someone treat his wounds? Was he hiding among them still? This uncertainty fueled rumors. One neighbor claimed she had seen a strange man lingering around the park a week earlier. Another said she heard unfamiliar footsteps outside her window that night. Police checked every lead, but nothing stuck. The media seized on these fragments anyway, feeding the cycle of panic. Meanwhile, the Miyazawa relatives grieved in public. Interviews with extended family showed faces pale with shock. Friends of the children broke down on camera, remembering playdates and laughter that would never return. The image of young Nina, only 8 years old, resonated most sharply: an innocent life, extinguished without reason. The nation mourned her as though she were everyone's child. Pressure on law enforcement escalated to unbearable levels. Politicians demanded answers. Police commissioners held press conferences assuring the public they were deploying their best resources. At one point, over 250,000 officers and investigators cycled through the case files, an unprecedented figure. Yet progress remained elusive. Critics began calling it a failure of modern policing. The Japanese police pride themselves on nearly 99% conviction rates achieved through thorough work, and some would argue intense prosecutorial tactics, but here, despite mountains of evidence, they had nothing. The media reminded the public daily, DNA doesn't lie, so why can't you find him? As the months passed, public fascination curdled into obsession. Documentaries aired in prime time. Newspapers ran anniversary pieces revisiting the crime scene with fresh photographs. Amateur sleuths launched their own theories online. One popular thread argued that the killer had military training, pointing to his efficient movements through the house, the control he displayed in overwhelming 4 people. Others believed he was an immature drifter, terrified yet too foolish to flee quickly. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the media frenzy itself damaged the case. By publicizing every detail, did they tip off the suspect to what police knew? Did the flood of speculation drown out useful witness accounts, or was the attention the only reason the case stayed alive, ensuring it would never be forgotten? And then there was the question of legacy. The Setagaya murders became a cultural scar often referenced in TV dramas, novels, and even classroom discussions. Teachers used it as a chilling reminder to lock doors, to be vigilant, to recognize the fragility of safety. Parents tucked their children into bed a little tighter, whispering reassurances they weren't sure they believed. Over time, the police shifted tactics. They began to speak less about progress, more about persistence. Every year near the anniversary of the murders, officers would stand outside the Miyazawa house and hand out flyers begging for information. They would renew public appeals: if you know something, anything, come forward. But each year the news cycle played out, the same candlelight vigils, sorrowful relatives, weary detectives, and no arrest. The case, it seemed, had become both immortal and unsolvable. Still beneath the grief and media pressure, an unease lingered. The killer had left so much behind: fingerprints, DNA, personal belongings. Ordinary logic suggested that eventually his identity would surface. Surely he couldn't vanish forever. Surely science or time or a single lucky tip would break the stalemate. And yet as the years slipped into decades, that hope grew fainter. Profilers in Japan and abroad have long wrestled with the puzzle of the Setagaya killer. With each clue left behind in that suburban home, the image of a strange, contradictory figure emerges, someone both meticulous and careless, violent yet oddly calm. Trying to understand him is like piecing together a portrait from fragments of shattered glass. First, the violence itself. Mikio Miyazawa, the father, suffered stab wounds inflicted with force and rage. The attacker had likely confronted him first, perhaps as Mikio sat in the study late at night. The struggle left clear signs: overturned chairs, blood sprayed across walls, defensive wounds on his arms. This suggests the killer had no hesitation, striking decisively in close combat. Yet after subduing Mikio, he moved methodically through the rest of the house. Yasuko, the mother, and little Nina, their daughter, were found together, as though they'd tried to protect each other. Ray, the 6-year-old son, had been killed in his sleep. The killer displayed an unsettling blend of efficiency and cruelty. Investigators noted he seemed unafraid of confrontation, but he also ensured silence by eliminating even the smallest witness. And then comes the baffling part: after extinguishing a family, he didn't flee. He lingered. He opened the refrigerator, ate ice cream, and drank tea. He sat at the family computer, browsing the internet as though it were his own. He even left his clothing behind, neatly discarded like a traveler changing outfits at the end of a long day. This behavior is deeply strange. criminal psychologists point to a phenomenon called post-crime comfort. Some killers linger to savor control or to deny the reality of their crime by performing everyday acts. Others do it out of confusion, unable to process the magnitude of their violence. Which category the Setagaya killer belongs to remains a matter of debate. Then there's the evidence of injury. Blood traces not belonging to the family were found throughout the house. Analysts concluded the killer cut himself during the attack, leaving droplets across multiple rooms. That suggests he may have been wounded badly enough to need medical attention afterward. And yet no hospital records from that time revealed a patient matching his DNA. So did someone secretly help him, or did he treat himself and vanish into the night? The personal belongings he abandoned add another layer. The hip bag, the sweaters, the scarf, all ordinary items but with unusual origins. The bag had traces of sand from a US military base in Japan. The clothing items came from mass-market brands, but the sizes suggested someone younger or smaller framed. The sneakers were rare, purchased mostly in South Korea. It's almost as if he carried with him the signatures of multiple places, leaving investigators to chase ghosts across borders. Some profilers sketch him as a young man, possibly a drifter with fractured ties to society. His recklessness, leaving fingerprints and DNA everywhere, suggests immaturity. His use of the Miyazawa's computer might have been curiosity or arrogance. Perhaps he was savoring the chaos he'd created. Others picture a more disciplined figure. His controlled movements through the house, the use of a sashimi knife, and the ability to subdue 4 victims suggest training. Was he ex-military, a martial arts practitioner, an intelligence operative passing through Tokyo? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the crime was a spontaneous eruption of rage or a coldly calculated mission gone wrong. Then there's the psychological profile. He showed no concern about time. Spending hours in a stranger's home after a massacre is incredibly risky. Did he believe he was invisible? Did he feel untouchable? Or was he simply detached from reality, living in a mental fog? Forensic psychologists note that killers who linger often display traits of borderline psychopathy, high impulsivity, low empathy, and an almost childlike inability to consider consequences. Some suggest he may have had undiagnosed mental illness. Others counter that his tactical efficiency contradicts that theory. Again, the contradictions pile up. Even his departure remains a riddle. He left through the front door, leaving it ajar. No footprints led away from the scene, as though he evaporated into thin air. Did someone pick him up? Did he slip into the nearby park where the darkness could hide him? Or did he live so close that he simply walked home unnoticed? In crime documentaries, this duality is often emphasized. The killer was both careless and cunning, a phantom who seemed to invite capture, yet escaped it. The more profilers describe him, the less human he seems, more like a shape-shifting figure stepping out of a nightmare. One academic summed it up in an interview years later. The Setagaya killer forces us to question our assumptions. He is either the luckiest criminal alive, or a ghost who understood how to vanish in plain sight. And this, perhaps, is what haunts people the most. The Miyazawa family's story isn't just about violence, it's about the presence of someone who should have been caught, who left every trace of himself behind, and yet remains nameless. A shadow sitting in their kitchen, touching their belongings, erasing 4 lives, and walking away into the Tokyo night. The psychological portrait remains incomplete, but one thing is certain: whoever he was, he carried both brutality and eerie calm in equal measure. That combination makes him unforgettable and possibly uncatchable. The Setagaya case would not remain confined to Japanese borders. As the years dragged on and the killer's identity remained elusive, investigators began to widen their scope, chasing threads that stretched far beyond Tokyo. If the man in the Miyazawa home was not local, then perhaps he was a traveler, a transient passing through, or even a foreign national with reasons to remain invisible in Japan. The strongest clue pushing them in this direction was, of course, the DNA. Samples of the killer's blood had been tested repeatedly. The results startled many. The genetic markers suggested a complex heritage, a paternal line connected to East Asia, possibly Korean Chinese or Japanese, and a maternal line showing links to southern Europe. This unusual mixture raised eyebrows because it didn't fit neatly into Japan's demographics at the time. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the DNA test was definitive or merely indicative. Some experts argued that the population studies used for comparison were too limited and that genetic overlap might easily lead to misinterpretation. But even the possibility of a mixed heritage killer shifted the narrative. Suddenly the case was no longer just a Japanese tragedy, it became a potential international crime story. Then came the sneakers. The rare Slazenger brand shoes found at the scene were distributed mainly in South Korea. Only a few hundred pairs had been sold in Japan. That narrowed things down significantly. Either the killer had bought them in Korea, or he had connections with someone who had. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe the case could be solved through international cooperation. Interpol was quietly consulted. South Korean authorities were asked to cross-check shoe sales and potential suspects. Rumors spread of ties to military families stationed near American bases because sand particles found in the killer's bag matched those found in training grounds used by US forces in Japan. Was he a soldier's child, a base worker, a young man who drifted between countries? The theory of a foreign connection became stronger when some linguists examined how the killer had accessed the Miyazawa's computer. He typed in Roman letters, not Japanese, kana. That could suggest he wasn't comfortable with the native script, though it could also mean nothing. Many Japanese youth were already blending English keystrokes into everyday typing. Still, when pieced together, the details hinted at someone who didn't quite belong. At the same time, other investigators pushed back. They argued that the foreign DNA angle was overemphasized. Mixed ancestry is rare in Japan but not unheard of, and the sneakers, while unusual, could have been purchased second-hand, even as hand-me-downs. To these skeptics, the focus on an international phantom was a distraction from looking closer to home. But the foreign suspect theory lingered, amplified by the media. Documentaries speculated about transient criminals moving between Asia and Europe. Some even suggested connections to organized crime networks, smugglers, or ex-soldiers. The odd behavior of the killer lingering in the house, eating using the computer, was framed as evidence of someone disconnected from Japanese cultural norms. Yet here lies the paradox. If the killer was foreign, how did he vanish so seamlessly afterward? Airports and ports were heavily monitored in the weeks following the crime. Immigration records were scrutinized. No suspicious exit was detected. Did he slip out before the police realized, or did he simply never leave Tokyo at all? The community around Setagaya was not a bustling urban hub. It was a quiet residential area. Neighbors knew each other. A stranger wandering the streets late at night might have been noticed. Unless, of course, the killer wasn't really a stranger, but someone who blended into the neighborhood. That possibility led some to reconsider maybe he wasn't foreign at all. Maybe the trail had gone cold because the killer was hiding in plain sight. Another international theory tied the case to South Korea more directly. A Japanese journalist uncovered reports of a young Korean man, unstable and violent, who had gone missing around the same period. Could he have slipped into Japan? There were whispers about ferry routes across the Korea Strait and about transient laborers working illegally in Tokyo. But none of those leads produced solid evidence. More speculative voices even floated the idea of espionage. The early 2000s were tense years in East Asia. Could the killer have been a spy or covert operative, his crime connected to something larger? It sounds cinematic, but investigators admitted the sand in the bag, the mixed heritage DNA and the lack of an arrest all fit awkwardly with a simple burglary gone wrong. Still, the evidence for an international suspect remains circumstantial. The killer's clothing was cheap and ordinary, nothing pointing to wealth or sophistication. His wounds suggested vulnerability. His decision to linger in the house felt reckless, not professional. Forensic profilers countered this was not the work of a spy or soldier, it was the work of a confused, angry young man. The truth perhaps lies in between. Maybe he was foreign-born but living in Japan. Maybe he had ties to multiple cultures, never fully belonging anywhere. A rootless figure who slipped through the cracks of identity paperwork and borders. That rootlessness, investigators noted, could explain both his violence and his vanishing act. Years later, with international cooperation, DNA databases in South Korea and Europe were quietly searched. No matches were ever confirmed. The trail remained empty. But the theory refuses to die. For many, the idea of a foreign killer gives shape to the otherwise incomprehensible, a phantom who descended on a Japanese family, left his mark and disappeared back into the vast anonymity of the world. And so the debate continues. Was the Setagaya murderer a foreigner passing through, or was he closer to home, someone the community never suspected? Each theory adds to the puzzle, each unanswered question tightening the air of mystery. And as time stretches on, the shadows of that night in Tokyo grow longer, hiding the truth further away. In the aftermath of the Setagaya murders, the public's faith in Japanese police was shaken. People wanted answers, but months turned into years and the case remained unsolved. Slowly, a new conversation began, not just about the killer, but about the investigation itself. Were critical mistakes made in those first few days? Did the authorities mishandle the largest trove of evidence in Japanese criminal history? At first glance, it seemed as if the police had everything. They had DNA fingerprints, footprints, clothing, food samples, and even the killer's waste left behind in the toilet. It was as if the suspect had begged to be caught, and yet nothing ever stuck. This paradox infuriated both citizens and criminologists alike. The most common criticism centered on contamination. In the days after the murder, as many as 140 officers, journalists, and even politicians entered the Miyazawa home. Some wore protective gear, others did not. Shoe covers weren't always enforced. Photographs show groups of people crowded together inside the crime scene, brushing past walls and standing on floors where the killer had walked. It doesn't take an expert to see how easily valuable trace evidence could have been compromised. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the massive evidence collected was reliable at all. Some suggest that the DNA and fibers gathered might have been mixed with those of the investigators themselves. Others argue that the sheer volume of samples, the thousands of pieces of clothing objects and skin cells bagged up, created a data overload that paralyzed the investigation. Having too much evidence, strangely enough, can be as crippling as having too little. Another issue lay in focus. Early on, police seemed convinced that robbery was the motive. They pointed to the ransacked drawers and missing wallet. But critics later argued this was a staged distraction. Too much emphasis was placed on money, too little on personal connections. The Miyazawas were not a random family. They had histories, relationships, and neighbors. Were all of those avenues thoroughly checked? Some retired detectives say no. The handling of the crime scene computer is another sore spot. The killer had logged on to Mikio's PC hours after the murders. Police confirmed the activity, but the trail went nowhere. Critics claim the authorities failed to properly trace the ISP or compare the behavior to other patterns in Japan's growing internet networks. In an era when digital forensics was still new, valuable data might have been lost forever. And then there was the public communication, or rather the lack of it. Police released limited information about the case, often years after the fact. When they did release details, such as the unique sneakers or the mixed heritage DNA, it fueled speculation more than clarity. Some journalists accused the police of holding back embarrassing mistakes, preferring silence to transparency. One of the strangest missteps came from the very abundance of physical items left behind. The killer's sweater, for instance, was traced to a single store in Tokyo. Yet investigators failed to confirm exactly when and where it had been sold, allowing any potential witnesses to fade into memory. A bag of sand found in his belongings was linked to a US military training ground, but no follow-up evidence connected the killer to any base or personnel. Each lead felt like a dead end, partly because the threads were not pursued aggressively enough. Families of victims in Japan often expect swift justice. In this case, frustration bubbled into anger. On anniversaries of the crime, the Miyazawa relatives made public appeals, urging the police to redouble their efforts. They criticized the lack of progress and the unwillingness to embrace new investigative techniques. Meanwhile, online communities began dissecting every detail, suggesting amateur theories, sometimes pointing fingers at innocent bystanders. The investigation's failures also opened broader debates about Japan's policing culture. Critics argue that Japanese police are highly effective at solving routine crimes but less adept at complex, unprecedented cases. Their reliance on confessions, so effective in normal investigations, became useless here, since no suspect had ever been identified. Without a person to interrogate, the system seemed paralyzed. By 2010, the case file had swollen to over 40,000 pieces of evidence, with 200 witness interviews and countless man-hours. Yet the killer's name remained absent. Observers began to say the investigation had turned into an archive, not an active hunt. Even within the police force, divisions appeared. Some officers believed they had been too cautious, too afraid of making a wrong move. Others believed they had been too rigid, unwilling to follow unconventional leads. A few insiders admitted that morale sank. Chasing a ghost for years had left them exhausted, their confidence shaken. Looking back, criminologists point to one haunting reality: the Setagaya killer likely left more identifying evidence than almost any criminal in Japanese history. And yet that very abundance turned the case into a labyrinth. Theories piled up, contradictions multiplied, and certainty became elusive. The question remains, was the case unsolvable from the start, or was it the police who made it unsolvable? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the Setagaya murders were a tragedy of crime alone or a tragedy of human error layered on top of it. Today, when Japanese citizens discuss unsolved mysteries, this case often serves as the prime example of investigative failure. It lingers like a scar on the nation's criminal justice system, a reminder that even with every clue laid bare, justice can still slip through human hands. As the years dragged on and the Miyazawa house stood frozen in time, the Setagaya murders slowly transformed from a brutal crime into a national ghost story. The case became more than evidence and suspects. It seeped into Japan's cultural memory, shaping how people thought about safety, vulnerability, and the hidden darkness of modern life. For the Miyazawa relatives, life never returned to normal. Yasuko's mother, who once cherished Sunday visits from her daughter and grandchildren, now lived with a void that could not be filled. On anniversaries of the murders, she and other family members stood outside the still sealed house, laying flowers, bowing deeply, their grief replaying in public. The image of mourning relatives at the overgrown house became a recurring headline, a grim ritual that kept the tragedy alive in the national consciousness. The neighborhood itself was never the same. Residents who once enjoyed quiet evenings in Setagaya began to feel haunted. Some sold their homes and left unable to live next to the crime scene. Others stayed, but spoke in hushed tones about the house, as if naming it too loudly might conjure the killer back. Even children in the area grew up with whispered warnings, "Don't walk alone near the Miyazawa house." The once ordinary suburb had become a landmark of fear. In broader Japanese society, the case cracked the illusion of absolute safety. Japan is famous for its low crime rate, where children walk to school alone and neighbors rarely lock their doors. But after the Setagaya murders, those cultural comforts were shaken. Suddenly people questioned whether safety was guaranteed even in the heart of Tokyo. Nighttime streets felt a little darker, the silence of suburbs a little heavier. The police, meanwhile, carried the weight of public disappointment. Each year, on the anniversary press conferences were held, where investigators promised they were still pursuing leads. But over time, these statements began to sound like empty ritual, more about saving face than progress. Journalists noticed the fatigue in their voices, the lack of fresh detail, yet the very absence of resolution gave birth to something unexpected: folklore. The Setagaya killer became a figure of myth whispered about in cafes and late-night TV specials. Was he a soldier from a foreign base, a deranged neighbor with a grudge, or perhaps a drifter who slipped across borders and vanished forever? Each theory added to the legend, and the killer's faceless identity became a canvas for collective imagination. Strange details, too, became symbolic. The sand found in the killer's clothing was debated endlessly. Was it from a US military base, a skate park, or somewhere else entirely? The unusual sneakers were mythologized as though they held the secret to unmasking him. Even the killer's calm behavior, eating ice cream, checking the computer, staying hours after the murders, was retold, like a ghost story, emphasizing his eerie lack of fear. In popular culture, the case inspired books, documentaries, podcasts, and even fictionalized dramas. Writers used the unsolved crime to explore themes of alienation, the fragility of family, and the cold anonymity of modern cities. Some academics compared the Setagaya murders to urban legends, like the man in the attic, where safety is shattered by an intruder who does not belong. For law enforcement, the case became a cautionary tale. Training programs highlighted the mistakes of Setagaya, the crowded crime scene, the mishandling of evidence, the reliance on old-school methods. Young recruits were taught that even in Japan, where order is the norm, chaos can erupt in unexpected ways. Remember Setagaya, one instructor reportedly said, "Because if you forget it, you'll repeat it." Psychologists also joined the conversation, using the case as an example in their lectures. They debated what kind of mind could linger so long in a murder scene, casually eating ice cream with blood on his hands. Was it sociopathy, or was it something less clinical and arrogance, born from knowing he might never be caught? Even today, investigators and detectives are still debating whether the killer's behavior reveals a methodical planner or a reckless opportunist. For the surviving family, though, theories were small comfort. Every anniversary was a reminder that justice had not been served. In interviews, they often said the same thing: "We just want to know why." The lack of motive haunted them more than anything. Why this family on this night in this house? Was it random, or was there a meaning locked away in the killer's silence? As the 20th anniversary approached, something unusual happened. Citizens from across Japan began leaving offerings near the Miyazawa house, flowers, letters, even children's toys. Many of them had never met the family, but the unsolved crime had become a shared wound, something that belonged to the whole nation. It was as if people were saying, if the killer cannot be found, at least the memory of the victims will not be lost. The house itself became a frozen relic of December the 30th of 2000. For years it remained sealed curtains, drawn lights forever off. Nature began reclaiming it. Vines crawled along the walls, dust gathered at the windows. Some described it as Japan's version of a haunted house, not because of ghosts, but because of what lingered unsolved. Eventually there were debates about whether to demolish it or preserve it as a memorial. Both options carried weight. Demolishing might erase the family's presence, but preserving might keep the wound open. In the end, the Setagaya murders were more than a crime. They became a mirror reflecting Japan's fears, its struggles with change, and its fragile belief in safety. The killer's footsteps may have disappeared into the night, but the echoes of that night still ripple through the nation's psyche. And perhaps that is why the case still resonates. It is not just about one family's tragedy. It is about the unsettling truth that even in the most ordinary places, shadows can fall without warning, and justice does not always arrive to chase them away. 2 decades later, the Setagaya house still stands. The windows are covered, the garden overgrown, and the front gate remains chained. Passers-by often lower their voices as they walk past, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the silence that has settled there. Time has moved forward for the rest of Tokyo. New stores have opened, trains still rattle past, neon lights still glow. But for this single house on a quiet corner, the clock is permanently stopped at December 30th, 2000. Inside police archives, boxes of evidence remain stacked, each labeled carefully: fingerprints, fibers, hair strands, DNA, swabs. Somewhere among those thousands of details is the truth, the identity of the man who turned an ordinary family's home into a crime scene. Yet year after year, that truth seems to slip further into shadow, as if the evidence itself is weighed down by the silence surrounding it. For many, what unsettles most is not just the brutality of the murders, but the ordinary details left behind. An empty ice cream wrapper, a computer screen flickering in the dark, a man who stayed in the house for hours as if he belonged there. These fragments keep people awake at night because they blur the line between the familiar and the terrifying. The killer did not rush. He lingered. He breathed the same air as his victims long after they were gone. To this day, investigators and detectives are still debating whether the crime was a calculated attack or the act of someone who simply stumbled into opportunity. The sand in the killer's clothing is still argued about in academic journals. Was it really from an American military base or just a common playground? The sneakers, once mass-produced but rare in Japan, are now treated like relics of a ghost. Even the killer's DNA, so definitive and exact, has not led to a name. But for the family members who remain, the questions are simpler, more human. They do not speak of sneakers or sand. They speak of smiles lost, of the sound of children's laughter that once filled the house, of the cruel emptiness that has lasted longer than 2 decades. We only want to know why one relative once said, her voice breaking, "Why them? Why that night?" The tragedy has left its mark far beyond Setagaya. It changed how people lock their doors, how they look at strangers, how they walk home at night. It also left a mark in the world of storytelling, books, films, and countless late-night programs that revisit the case, not just to solve it, but to remind us that mysteries sometimes remain unsolved. And maybe that is why the Setagaya murders are still spoken of with a whisper. Because in a world that often promises order and safety, this case is a reminder that some shadows cannot be pushed away. So as you sit there tonight listening to this story, imagine the quiet streets of Setagaya. A house where the lights never came on again. Evidence sitting in boxes waiting for answers that may never arrive. A family frozen in memory while the world outside keeps moving forward. Now slow down your breathing. Let the images fade. The house grows distant, the crime scene blurs, and what remains is only the sound of your own breath in the dark, because even in the most ordinary places, mysteries linger. and some voices vanished, though they maybe still speak to us in silence. Next time we're going to travel again, this time to another part of the world where mystery and tragedy collide. Imagine an island surrounded by restless waves where disappearance is not just a possibility, but a repeating pattern. Imagine a family gathering that ended in silence, leaving only shadows to tell the story. We'll step carefully into another unsolved case, one where the suspects are not only human, but sometimes whispered about as something more, where the police files are thick, but the answers are thin, and where even decades later, locals still shake their heads and say, "We may never know the truth." If the Setagaya murders showed us how fragile safety can be inside a quiet home, then our next story will show us how fragile memory is when distance and isolation hide the facts. Together we'll trace the footprints left behind, whether in the snow, the sand, or perhaps only in rumor. So keep your cushions close, your lights low, and your curiosity sharp. Because the night is long, the world is wide, and mysteries are everywhere waiting for us to listen.